What do you know about Charles Trevelyan? Well, certainly he's as close to a national folk villain as it's possible to get, isn't it? And in the Fields of Athenry, which is a surprisingly modern song written by Pete St. John in the late 1970s, it's Trevelyan who's synonymous with the starvation. And if you stand around Dublin Castle long enough on any given day, you'll hear the words of Trevelyan quoted by a tour guide or 12, who's remembered for saying that the judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson. That calamity must not be too much mitigated. The real evil with which we have to contend is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the people. We perhaps imagine Trevelyan sitting in a well-defended Dublin castle as a crisis grew beyond its gates and defences, and the castle, with its social calendar continuing apace even through the worst of the crisis, a place not only of political business but upper class socialising, a hate symbol. I mean, the worst thing you could be labelled in Ireland for a long time, a castle Catholic. But what if I told you Trevelyan was in Ireland only once during the course of the Great Hunger, and that was a brief visit? And you might be surprised as well, shocked even to hear, that Trevelyan was very much in his day considered a liberal. There's a lot to ponder in Padraic X. Scanlan's excellent Rot and New History of the Great Hunger, and reviewing the book in the Irish Times, historian Brendan McSivna noted correctly that it was a book that brought new perspectives to the table on how we understand this defining event. The rot not merely being the rotten potatoes in the ground, but I suppose the political system. And as McSivna wrote, a socio-economic and political system shaped by conquest and colonialism, and fatally for the poor by a conviction that austerity and the market would deliver improvement. We don't necessarily think of the crisis that began in 1845 as a Dublin story, and yet Dublin was the centre of the British bureaucratic machine on the island of Ireland. It may have been a city without a parliament, yes, but it was the connection between Ireland and the heart of the empire. Dublin was a port from which hundreds of thousands would emigrate, and also a port from which livestock would continue to be exported. Dublin was a city that had been politically to the forefront of Daniel O'Connell's repeal movement in the immediate years before, and though it's not part of the memory of the city, Dublin, city, but particularly county, I mean, Dublin was very rural beyond its city heartland. Dublin was a place where people, and lots of people, died. When Queen Victoria visited Dublin in August 1849, one of the few acts of protest came from Dublin. On South Great George's Street, one man, Mr. O'Reilly, hoisted on top of his house a large black banner displaying the crownless harp and draped his windows with black curtains, showing the words famine and pestilence. The police, John Mitchell remembered, burst into his house, tore down the flag and the curtains, and thrust the proprietor into jail. Whatever little resistance there was to the royal visit was on the streets of Dublin. And amidst all of this, Dublin was also the setting of one particularly peculiar moment, which forms the backbone of this episode, the visit of Alexis Soyer, a celebrity chef, and we'll get into what that meant in the context of the Victorian world, who would establish a soup kitchen in front of the Royal Barracks at the site we now know as Croppy's Acre. Just think there in front of the National Museum. Chef of the Reform Club in London from 1837, Alexis Soyer's food would have been enjoyed by members of the political class in Britain, but here he was in a very different environment, opening this experimental soup kitchen to feed the Irish poor. Trevelyan himself enthusiastically welcomed him. Why? Scanlan's study, Rot, A History of the Irish Famine, is available now. I picked my copy up in Hodges Figgis. Ultimately, it's a book that does something very important because it places empire and economics at the centre of how we understand this crisis. Ireland, it correctly tells us, was a laboratory for empire. Lots of news. The Dublin Festival of History programme launches on Tuesday. If you're on the podcast Patreon, I'll post a guide to that with a few events I really recommend tomorrow evening. But it's fastest fingers first, of course, on Tuesday morning. And let us pray the site doesn't crash. It often does. You're going to Electric Picnic. Hope you're going to Electric Picnic and the weather is good. So am I. On the Saturday down there, I'll be talking to Brian Kerr, who needs no introduction, football pundit, football man, former Republic of Ireland manager, but someone who lives and breathes football, but is also just very interesting to talk to in the most general terms. And I think we'll be going through everything from football to music, politics, and life. And that is on Saturday at 20 to 3 on the podcast stage in the Minefield area. So it'd be really nice to see some of you next Saturday if you're down at Electric Picnic. Pack the wellies. Be safe. In September 1845, the London Gardener's Chronicle asked their readers a good question. Where will Ireland be in the event of a universal potato rot? At home, the curator of the Botanic Gardens was asking the same question, because just a few weeks earlier, on the 20th of August, David Moore ominously noted the arrival of the disease that had been observed across Europe. The Scottish-born botanist, who would serve as director of the Botanic Gardens for some 4 decades, has left an extraordinary legacy to the place, but that date is one with which his name is completely synonymous. It was a ominous sign of what was to come. At first, the scale of what lay ahead, of course, was unclear. People often don't realise they're in a crisis till it's too late. It would be in the following year when the temperance priest, Father Theobald Matthew, whose statue is now on O'Connell Street, would describe witnessing a crop transformed into one wide waste of putrefying vegetation. But to understand the great hunger at the very outset, we need to understand the potato itself. This was not a crisis that was unique to Ireland or contained to Ireland. The only thing Irish about it was the total overdependence of the Irish poor on this foodstuff. But as Padraic notes, it was a food that was entangled in questions of empire and was a modern crop.
Yeah, I mean, the potato, to me, right, it has this kind of essential association with Ireland and Irishness. But I think it's very easy to forget, at least if you're getting wrapped up in that sort of romantic sense of Irish history, that the potato is a very modern crop, right? It's a product of the contact between the Spanish and Portuguese empires in the Americas. Historians sometimes call it the Columbian Exchange, and so it was a crop that arrived in Europe as part of a transcontinental exchange of food and flora and fauna and pathogens, and it was widely adopted across Western Europe, wherever it was convenient for peasants and smallholders to get a kind of backstop crop against war, particularly in the 17th century in Germany during the era of the 30 Years' War, right? The potato saved a lot of people's lives. And in Ireland, right, the potato had that role as a backstop crop throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. And it was really only with the intensification of British imperialism in the Atlantic world and with the intensification of British colonialism in Ireland in the 18th century, especially after the Glorious Revolution, that the potato went from being a backstop crop to being a staple, and then eventually a hyper staple that I don't think has an equal anywhere else in Europe, even in places like northern France or Belgium or Poland, where the potato, is a staple crop. It The degree to which the Irish poor depended on the potato is really astonishing when you think about it, but it's become naturalized in part because of the kind of um, romantic or mythic association between potatoes and Irishness. And so I think it represents colonialism, but it also represents adaptation to colonialism, right? It has this ambiguous it had this ambiguous value for the people who relied on it because it both, in a sense, kept them in poverty, but also kept them alive. And they kind of rode the 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 sort of the gulf between those two states of being.
The Ireland of the 1840s sits in a peculiar place. It's part of an empire that has experienced the most extraordinary economic transformation. The birth of new cities and new industries had transformed Britain itself, an industrial revolution. And it's 1845, the very year that the Irish crisis bites, that Frederick Engels describes a town such as London, where a man may wander for hours together without reaching the beginning of the end. Colossal centralisation. This heaping together of 2.5 millions of human beings at one point. London, Engels wrote, has been raised to the commercial capital of the world, which created the giant docks and assembled the 1,000 vessels that continually cover the Thames. While Dublin may have been physically close to cities like Liverpool on the neighbouring island, Ireland was also a world away from everything that was happening next door. And through the docks of Dublin and other Irish cities, left food and more, providing for what was happening there.
This kind of poor, almost entirely agricultural society that is connected politically, but really like culturally estranged from the United Kingdom, and also politically estranged from the United Kingdom, even though, 100 Irish MPs sit in Parliament, is that the pressures of industrialization in the Britain proper were being applied in Ireland in the 1820s and the 1830s and the 1840s as the demand, especially for export crops, increased. And even more than kind of oats or other kind of cereals, the demand for the production of meat really fell really, really heavily on Irish farms. So, you have this bizarre situation where Ireland is producing hundreds of thousands of pigs every year that are being shipped across the Irish Sea, right? That are being shipped via Liverpool, right? And then put on trains to Manchester. Or if they're poor quality pigs, they're being slaughtered in abattoirs in Ireland in coastal cities and then processed there, which is about the closest thing you're going to get to an industrial scale factory in an Irish port city, or industrial scale canning and processing and salting and curing facilities for pork. Um, and all of those animals are flowing out of Ireland, but pork really doesn't form any kind of significant part of the diet of, not of the entire Irish population, but of the roughly probably 2 million people who live on the edge of starvation all the time, right? And so that's, in a population of just under 9 million people on the eve of 1845, that's a really substantial portion of the population who are producing a lot of meat for the market and who more or less never eat it themselves.
It takes time before those caught in the crisis realise the magnitude of it, but by 1847, there were moments of chaos on the streets of Dublin. Christine Keneally, one of the foremost historians of the crisis, details the emergence of a group who christened themselves the Hungry Mob, parading the streets of the Liberties and taking bread by force from bakeries. On one occasion, 22 arrests were made, and it took the intervention of troops on the streets to get people to leave. On other occasions, bread carts were attacked in places like Bridgefoot Street. An extraordinary 200 people attacked a bread cart on Dorset Street. And in all of these cases, she notes, the convicted often came not from Dublin, but from the countryside. It's very easy to see in the newspapers this worsening crisis as the rural poor move into the urban centres. It must be easier there, they hope. But at the beginning of it all, there's little realisation of the scale of this horror. Potatoes, like any crop that come out of the ground, were vulnerable. The crop did fail on occasion, and there had been an entire series of crises before.
Ireland had experienced cyclical famines almost, virtually every growing season. And it had experienced very serious subsistence crises, in 1817, concomitant with a typhus epidemic, in the 1820s, in 1830, 1831. There had been subsistence crises related to failures of the potato that were significant enough that the British Coast Guard had to start shipping in grain and selling it, right? I mean, these were not national subsistence crises; they were regional subsistence crises, but they were big enough to require, or at least in the eyes of the British government, to require a kind of organized military intervention to try to palliate the growing hunger and the unrest that came from that. And so, there's a sense in which the British officials imagined this was just another subsistence crisis and that it was being leveraged at a moment of political tension, like pretty profound political tension between Britain and Ireland, a moment when the UK seemed like it was might fisher, maybe, to maybe leverage either greater would be like greater economic privileges within the union or to explode the union entirely. And so there are all of these reasons that militate and kind of persuade British officials that this can't be the big one because every single previous one seemed like the big one and nothing happened, or things happened but nothing that registered as a national crisis happened.
There are some famous first-hand accounts of the Ireland of this time, and many, of course, are accounts of rural Ireland. One of the most famous comes from Alexander Somerville, soldier, recounting, as we passed along, groups of squalid beings were seen at road corners or running to see the meal go past them under the protection of bullets, bayonets, and cavalry swords. But we get a sense of Dublin in the letters of the famed American abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who arrived in the city in August 1845, the very same month that discovery is made in the Botanic Gardens. He would write about how I spent nearly 6 weeks in Dublin, and the scenes I there witnessed were such as to make me blush and hang my head to think myself a man. I speak truly when I say I dreaded to go out of the house. The streets were almost literally alive with beggars displaying the greatest wretchedness. As Padraic notes, Douglass not only is a marvellous writer, he's writing to an American audience.
And so he's speaking to an audience and he's speaking to an audience of abolitionists in the United States who are by this time more radical in their orientation towards the abolition of slavery, right? In the British Empire, British abolitionists never conceive of emancipation as anything other than a very gradual process that would, slavery ends, but the process of transformation of the formerly enslaved subject into the wage laborer is A, essential, and B, is going to take a very long time and is going to happen under the management of white British officials who will just be a better set of imperial officials than the ones who had previously run plantation colonies. But so Douglass is speaking to an audience where he is explicitly trying to draw, I think, a kind of connection for an American audience between the poverty of Irish laborers and the poverty of enslaved laborers.
Short of Oliver Cromwell, there's perhaps no name as detested in Ireland as that of Charles Trevelyan. But Trevelyan, Padraic writes, was not a Napoleonic figure, bending the treasury around his own ambition and will to power. Liberal, evangelical, are words that are vital to understanding this man. And when it comes to the ideology of empire, as Padraic puts it, we probably need to go to India to understand Trevelyan's thinking.
Yeah, exactly. Trevelyan is um, two things help you to help to understand where Charles Trevelyan comes from. And the first is that, right, he is part of the same circle of liberal evangelicals as the leaders of the anti-slavery movement. So his patron is Thomas Babington Macaulay. He's married to Thomas Babington Macaulay's sister. The Macaulays are like the leading liberal family of the first half of the 19th century in Britain. They're very pious. They're connected to the Wilberforces, to the Clarksons. He is part of that circle. And that circle is one so that's you need to kind of understand his liberalism as coming from a very sort of gradualist, very kind of civilized, like a sort of obsession with civilizational progress and the measurement of civilizational progress. Right, that's the kind of ideology of empire that animates him. And for Trevelyan, the most significant engine of civilizational progress is the operation of the market, and in conjunction with education. So when he starts his career as a clerk in India. That's where he meets Thomas Babington Macaulay, and he becomes this kind of liberal firebrand in the Indian administration, who is preoccupied with both opening markets in India and encouraging English style education, and Christianization in Indian society. And that puts him, that eventually became, I think like that evangelical project in India had its peaks and troughs in the 19th century, but it was never British imperial policy to Christianize India because India's economic significance was just so vast in comparison to basically any other imperial territory. And in order to keep that, and Britain could rule India with an iron fist, but it needed clients and it couldn't alienate its clients. And so Trevelyan comes from this position, and then he ends up back in Britain. He's sort of on the outs for a little bit, and then he ends up through the patronage of Thomas Babington Macaulay, ending up in the Treasury office.
One initiative that Trevelyan enthusiastically supported was that of Alexis Soyer, chef at London's Reform Club. I mean, the Reform Club was such a symbol of the political class in Britain. It was later bombed by the Fenians during their dynamite campaign in London in the late 19th century. And the Reform Club was basically an exclusive private club on Pall Mall, home to the Whigs. Soyer had written to the press in England on the question of the misery in Ireland and what response he felt should be taken to it. He sent recipes to the press which he believed were sufficient to provide nutritional value for those in dire need. And Trevelyan, we learn from the book, instructed a Liverpool ironworks to prepare for bulk orders of custom-designed boilers and arranged for Soyer's passage to Dublin. In March 1847, the worst year of the crisis, Black 47, this celebrity chef arrived in Dublin.
The soup kitchen is set up on the Croppies Acre, right in front of what's now part of the National Museum. Yeah, it is. So yeah, right. Alexis Soyer is like the first. I mean, I don't know if you want to call him the first celebrity chef, but he is certainly a chef and a celebrity. But he's not like Nigella, you know. He wouldn't be recognizable, although he did kind of affect, a big kind of floofy toque. So he did kind of, you would know, hey, there's a chef, like kind of like the Swedish chef on the Muppets. Um, and he's the chef of the Reform Club, which is still in operation, but is now kind of more of a relic of a different era of British politics, but at the time was basically the clubhouse of the Whig Party. And so he's already, and Trevelyan is maybe a little bit more of because of his evangelicalism, because of his piety, he's not the sort of person who would maybe spend that much time at the club. Unlike his boss, John Russell, whose portrait hangs still at the Reform Club. But I'm not sure exactly how, and so he had a kind of like very Whiggish in a sense, like combination of public spiritedness and a desire for profit, right? In a sense, he kind of exemplified one of the strains of British liberalism in the era of the famine, which was the very firm and kind of untouchable belief that a market that a kind of bustling market could not just improve people's economic well-being, but actually improve the world in a very tangible, linear sense. And so I don't know exactly where he gets. He published it before he went to Ireland. He published a couple of cookbooks that were designed for the poor. And so they were the sort of thing that middle-class reformers, you could buy them, 1,000 copies for whatever, 10 shillings. And then you would either give them out for free or sell them for a penny when you went to people's houses in the slums. And these cookbooks have these recipes that are, you could probably make them. But Soyer's big innovation as a cook was to stretch ingredients as far as possible, right? And that's kind of what his cookbooks, I think, an historian who was interested in the history of food could probably find a lot about the early history of nutrition in soy. I mean, he was criticized a lot in the medical press, so you could probably find a history of nutrition there. But Soyer was really good. His specialty as a chef for the poor was to make something that tasted like more than it was. And at some point, he got the idea that was as you say, enthusiastically taken up by Trevelyan and by others in Trevelyan's circle, of setting up a model soup kitchen in Dublin as a kind of, and I think Trevelyan imagined that it would be something that could be copied and replicated and kind of like reproduced all around the countryside, although that's not really, in the end, as we can maybe talk about later, that's not really what happened. But first of all, like even setting up a soup kitchen was already a really big rupture in British imperial policy towards Ireland. Because under the Irish Poor Law of 1838, any form of outdoor poor relief was absolutely and strictly forbidden. And after the worst year of the crisis on a national level in 1846, 1847, Parliament passed a law to basically briefly allow the operation of soup kitchens in order to kind of allow poor law unions to give out food.
Accounts of Soyer's kitchen survive, which Scanlan describes. This was a 6-minute eating experience, but what horrified some was that you could actually buy a ticket to watch the spectacle. The Freeman's Journal had very little good to say about the event. They wrote that of all the impotent and insulting humbugs that ever were perpetuated against the suffering people, we hold the exhibition of yesterday at the Royal Barracks to have been the most outrageous. The newspaper's condemnation of it all was straight to the point. 5 shillings each to see paupers feed. 5 shillings each to watch the burning blush of shame. The animals at the zoological gardens may be inspected at a feeding time for 6pence. We hope that as these 5 shillings each were to be given to charity, the poor unfortunates who earned them with scalding tears and bitter humiliation and galling shame were not forgotten, and that on this occasion they were presented, when the performance was over, with something more than a fine cake. Soyer was capable, he claimed, of making up to 100 gallons of soup for under £1. A remarkable achievement, though the soup itself was often derided in the press. And some contemporaries kind of commented that it wasn't so much soup for the poor man as it was just poor quality soup. It's interesting, on YouTube, you can actually see examples of people cooking up some of Alexis Soyer's recipes today. And Soyer was wined and dined in the city, a dinner at the Freemasons' Hall before departure. In London, a large party in his honour upon his return with 150 guests. Incapable of reading the room, the hosts on that occasion served dinner on gold and silver plates. Now in Dublin, of course, the ballad is one way in which reputations are made and destroyed, and Padraic presents examples of that. My curse on such impostors and Bell Soyer and his soup. The nutritional value of the soup, I mean, not only are people challenging it today on YouTube, even in its day, Scanlan is totally correct in writing of how, the Irish poor needed food, not demonstrations of culinary finesse or economy. They needed more.
We have accounts of it, like a big kind of canvas tent in the middle, right in front of the barracks. And he was an inventor as well. Later, he became quite famous for his kind of mobile catering supplies that were actually saved a lot of people's lives in the Crimean War. So he sets up this kind of mobile, huge bain-marie, and these tables, right? And he sets up, and the tables have bowls in them with spoons chained to them. And I think it's every 6 minutes, right? The bowls are filled, and another 100 people kind of stream in and out of the soup kitchen, are fed, have a bread roll, bowl of soup, eat it in 6 minutes, and stream out again. And they sell, you can buy a ticket to see it happening if you're a member of sort of Dublin middle class or upper class society. And it becomes this kind of really genuinely bizarre and kind of ghoulish, in my view at least, this kind of ghoulish performance or circus that's in the center of the capital that is designed to kind of signal what, I'm not sure. It's a really strange experiment. Yeah, it's a strange display. Meanwhile, right, there's regiments massing in Phoenix Park just in case something goes wrong in Dublin.
Soup kitchens across Ireland would later number in the thousands, and it was an intervention of poor law unions and described as a unique but short-lived direct attack on starvation. But as Scanlan notes, the poor quality of what was on offer was often commented on, along with the degrading nature of the experience. The feeding of dogs in a kennel, one observer wrote, was far more decent and orderly. For people who sometimes walked up to 10 miles for this austere offering, it was very little reward. And as one letter writer complained in the Times, this supply may keep our people from dying, but it certainly is not a supply for the sustenance of working men. The Great Hunger has its place today in memorialisation in the capital. Of course, there are well-known monuments. Rowan Gillespie's 1997 work, by the Liffey, showing the family as they walk towards migration. Edward Delaney's Famine in St. Stephen's Green behind Wolfe Tone. There are plaques, one I love, on the side of Cleary's, Sackville Place, a beautiful plaque to Paul Edmund Strzelecki, a very important figure who worked with the British Relief Association over a period of 18 months. An explorer who had a kind of career pivot overseeing the distribution of relief in the west of Ireland. He wrote that the population seems as if paralysed and helpless, more ragged and squalid, fearfully dejected. Strzelecki had his office on Sackville Street, hence the monument. And even there, things were miserable. The Freeman's Journal reported in May 1847 of a woman named Eliza Holmes arrested by the police while begging on Sackville Street, her dead infant child in her arms. Near the end of this book, Scanlan touches on everything that followed. The revolution, of course. And he's right. He says the Rising, the War of Independence, all of that, they had their own proximate causes. There were things like the First World War that brought about those events. But the Great Famine was in the background, he writes, a wound that gave shape to the idea of the nation. The memory of that disaster and that starvation appears in some of the memoirs of those who took part in the Irish Revolution, and in Bureau of Military History witness statements. They often talk about what it meant. Jim Larkin Jr., son of the Labour leader, remembered Dublin as a city with the never-ending influx of labourers from the countryside and their inherent memories of the famine. But the Great Hunger is perhaps not something we ourselves now think of as part of the journey to the revolution, part of the journey to nationhood. And as Padraic notes, that's not entirely surprising. How we speak and understand the event can vary hugely. To the Irish diaspora, it means something else entirely to what it means here.
Yeah, I noticed that, right? And I mean, I think I'm writing from, the diaspora where the Great Hunger is the central founding moment of the Irish diaspora, and I think, is the thing that is most, people of some Irish heritage in North America and Australia or anywhere, would have some kind of connection to, or most people, I was struck at how the line kind of stops in 1851 or even in 1847, and then, then all of a sudden the story of the Great Hunger is something that is happening on the other side of the Atlantic or on the other side of the Pacific. And then something else is happening on the ground with the people who are still like occupying a now depopulated and increasingly depopulating Irish countryside. I don't have a good answer to that. It is really striking. I think maybe there's an element of, speaking of humiliation, right? Like to think about the founding moment of like a modern European country as being a incredibly complicated and horrific multidimensional catastrophe is maybe not necessarily as, it's not like the French Revolution, right? Or German or like German unification, or like the campaign of Italian unification. It's a very different kind of national myth that maybe is less appealing when you're looking for a usable past, as opposed to a story of kind of heroic resistance to empire.
Thanks so much to Padraic X Scanlan for coming on and talking about Rot. I think it's a book you'll really enjoy. And as I said at the beginning, I just think it reframes that crisis in a very interesting way in the context of empire and economy. I'll be back soon. More episodes on the way. Hopefully, as I said, see some of you next Saturday in a field talking the Brian Kerr. Until then, slán go fóill.